How's it going, everybody? Fully Baked here. This is a part 2 in a series of reviews of Sonic Colors, and in this episode we'll be talking about the worlds and the Wisps. There's no point delaying it, so let's start with part 3, the worlds. And if you want to see parts 1 through 2, I suggest going to see the last episode. Sonic Colors has some very interesting world designs, so I'll go over each of them individually here. Tropical Resort being the starting world is a pretty good choice on the devs' part. Where most worlds would start out calming, which we'll get later in the form of Planet Wisp and Aquarium Park, this one's more so just fun to be in. It doesn't really do anything interesting mechanic-wise, but I'll get more into the design of the levels later. This level is more so appreciated for the visual aspect, which is top-notch in my opinion. I'd say not many levels in the Sonic franchise look like this, but this design is probably the most generic of the bunch. Not to say it's bad, of course, but it feels very similar to the other casino-themed acts in the Sonic franchise. You could argue it's almost harkening back to those stages, but I digress. It's very happy feeling, which the music helps with. There are balloons everywhere which you can bounce off of, there's a lot of landscape running sections that give you a good idea of the scope of this place, and it's just an overall great starting level. It's definitely a nice break from tradition. Next up on our list we have Sweet Mountain, which is definitely the most visually unique world in the game. This game did the whole World of Food thing years before Mario Odyssey, which I gotta give it props for. They don't necessarily overly incorporate themes of food throughout this world, but there are still a lot of clever uses of it. A lot of the loops are replaced with donuts. In Act 2 you're climbing up a big hamburger tower, there are these huge missiles filled with candy that get launched at you, you drift along huge sections of shortbread swinging along lollipops, etc. The first 3 worlds of this game are definitely the most visually pleasing, which I've gotta give it props for. Sweet Mountain also introduces some of the most fun Wisps in the game, but I'll get more into those when I talk about the Wisps and later on the level portion. Figured it was something worth mentioning here, but speaking of Wisps, and I'll keep this brief, this is the only world in the game to make use of every single Wisp in a single world, which surprises me because this is only the second world. But all in all, Sweet Mountain is fun to play, it's cleverly designed, and it's pretty visually appealing. Moving on to the third world, we have one of my favorites, Starlight Carnival. This one definitely feels like it takes advantage of its level setup the most, even if that level setup isn't very unique. You run around on these rapidly generating light paths in between ships, which, despite the fact that it's an auto-runner, feels really fun, satisfying, and grandiose. Most of the actual gameplay takes place in the ships on the Carnival, and despite the fact that I'll mention this later, there's this really cool moment nearing the ending of one of the acts where you use hover and launch rings to ascend what I assume is a carrier ship, which feels really satisfying. This world also introduces some more Wisps, which I'll get into later of course, but the way they impact gameplay varies quite a bit, which I appreciate. The boss fight at the end is definitely one of my favorite boss fights in the game. Chasing down the ship feels really satisfying, if not super simple. It'd be my favorite boss fight in the game if it wasn't for one we're going to get to later. If you've seen my previous video, you probably know what my favorite boss fight in the game is, but all in all, Starlight Carnival is still very fun, very visually appealing, and probably one of my favorite worlds in the game. Planet Wisp is up next, and it's probably the most interesting one to talk about. The music here is probably the highlight. Act 3 is one of my favorite video game BGMs I've ever heard, but like I said, I'll get to that later. This level is also one of my favorite looking levels, transforming from a nice green landscape into a robotic factory. It's a pretty good contrast, but this world has some of the most questionable level designs of any of the worlds in this game. Some of the red rings have weird placements or requirements. There are not many places where you can really freely run, unlike the light paths in Starlight Carnival or the numerous drift sections in Sweet Mountain. Some of the mechanics feel weird to maneuver in, like in Act 4 when climbing the tower. Some of the platform movements feel wonky, and the Wisps use locations are actually pretty obscure. Lastly, this level introduces one of my least favorite Wisps in the game, but again, I'll return to that. So Planet Wisp is definitely one of the weirder levels to talk about in this game, and it's definitely contrasting where I like how this world looks, but I don't really like how it plays. Aquarium Park follows suit, and this is probably the most recognizable stage in this game. It has these very Japanese-inspired architecture, and it's a water level. To be honest, that's what really sets it apart here. It looks great, the water controls surprisingly well, there's an actual mini-boss here, the music is iconic, it's a great level. If I'm being honest though, as memorable as it may be, I just don't really feel it stands out. Maybe because it's one of 2 worlds in the game that doesn't introduce a new Wisp, but I mean, you have these industrial food levels running throughout massive spaceships, and here's just kind of a water level. Aquarium Park is definitely cool, but in my mind, it didn't really stick out to me. Asteroid Coaster, on the other hand, is very graphically unique and features some memorable game mechanics, like flying along on these roller coasters and some fun anti-gravity sections. Asteroid Coaster is the second most difficult stage in this game for me, trumped only by Planet Wisp, but that may be due to the questionable level design. Here though, it feels really fleshed out. This last world really feels like they had a lot of ideas, so they just kind of inserted them all into these 6 acts and just ran with them. It really works to its benefit as well. Like I said, there's the roller coasters, but this world also has a mini-boss, running around on Saturn's rings, homing in on asteroids, asteroids, it's a hell of a lot of fun and makes for a great last level, even if it's not technically the last level. That would go to Terminal Velocity, one of my favorites unironically, even though it's 3 acts, one of which is the final boss fight and the other one lasts 30 seconds. Damn it, in my mind it really does shine. This level has unironically one of the coolest concepts for a level I've ever played. You're running down a giant elevator shaft into space back down to Earth. You can't tell me that isn't awesome. Visually, it's not exactly stunning, but it certainly drives the feeling home. Yes, you can only sidestep in these segments, but if you had free range of movement, I don't think it would have worked as effectively because it would have eliminated the constant running and allowed you to take away one of its most striking aspects. Overall, Terminal Velocity is short, but it's really damn fun for what's given to you. Lastly on the worlds list, we have Gameland, which is a weird case. You only unlock every stage in Gameland after getting every single red ring, so it's not super likely everyone is going to experience it. And honestly, I think that's okay, because Gameland is probably the weakest world in this game. It's completely different from every other world in the game in a multitude of ways, which I'll list off here. Difference number 1, you can actually choose on a scale from 1 to 5 how fast your character moves. And the reason I say your character instead of saying Sonic is because number 2, you can actually play as your Mii in this world. Number 3, Gameland technically has 21 acts, but they're each divided into 3 sections, and for each set of 3 levels you complete, you get a Chaos Emerald, which is how Super Sonic is unlocked. Number 4, there are no level ranks here, so the goal is just to get to the end. Lastly, number 5, this is the only place in the game that has active co-op gameplay, probably due to its smaller and more compact level design. However, looking at it, you can probably figure out why I called this the weakest world in the game. It completely abandons the unique and fun aesthetics the other worlds have and gives what feels like a debug map. Yeah, if I had to describe Gameland, I'd say it feels most like a place the devs would go to test out stuff like rolling balls and slot machines, only to decide they didn't really fit, but instead of scrapping those levels, they just left them in here. It feels lazy and the level design isn't really fleshed out, but I guess that's what you get after grinding for the red rings. Hey, at least we get fun pixelated remixes of each of the World 1 act themes, which is a pretty nice touch. Okay, so up next on our list of things to talk about is, unfortunately, probably one of the weakest aspects of the game, and sadly, it's the game's main selling point: the Wisps. Yeah, if you couldn't tell, I don't really like the Wisps, so let's go over them individually and I'll try to explain to you why I don't like most of them. First Wisp you encounter is the white one, which is probably admittedly the best one. The way it works is simple: you press the boost button and you go fast. The thing I like most about it is it doesn't really affect gameplay and the controls. It is really a case of it's there if you want to use it and it gives a combat advantage in some scenarios. It's required to get some of the red rings, meaning there is a level of strategy with boosting as opposed to the later titles where you can just boost through the stage. But I digress. The white Wisp is probably the simplest and most fun Wisp to use. Next up is the Cyan/Laser Wisp. The premise of this Wisp is simple. Pressing the Wisp button causes Sonic to turn into a laser beam that you can briefly control before it fires off. If you're in a 2D section, you can only fire it up and down, and if you're in a 3D section, you can only fire it left and right. Honestly, I don't really like Cyan Wisp. My main problem with it is the predictability, or rather the lack thereof. I always found it difficult to tell exactly where I was aiming, despite the short line it gives you. Once you start it, you're locked into using it too, so if you accidentally used it in a place where bouncing off the walls will send you off in a place you don't want to go, too bad. While it can lead to cool results like near the end of Act 2 on Tropical Resort, I never really like using this one. Next up is Yellow/Drill. When activated on soft ground, meaning dirt/cake, you drill into it and can move around in 360 degrees of movement. It can also be used underwater and it has a different theme for that. You can also boost by holding the boost button and it cannot be used in 3D. This one seems good initially and for the most part, it is. Control-wise, it's tight even if it's not perfect. It feels kinda satisfying to drill through the dirt and water, and taking out enemies/bosses with this thing is pretty fun. But there's one big thing holding this Wisp back, and that is that it is completely unnecessary. At literally no point in the game do you actually need to use it. So while it may feel kinda satisfying, unless you're going for all the red rings, there's never any use for this thing. The next Wisp you come across is the Orange/Rocket Wisp. When used, you shoot very quickly up into the air, and when it's over, you fall back down in a free fall, able to move left and right. Like the previous one, this cannot be used in 3D sections. It's super simple, but honestly, I like that about it. Unlike pretty much every other Wisp in the game, this one really is a press it and it's a one and done, even taking away the aiming of the Cyan Wisp. It's a very simple concept, but it feels really satisfying to use, and free falling is also pretty fun. If I had to nitpick and find a problem, I'd say when it's supposed to be used to get red rings, it can be difficult sometimes to tell where you're supposed to use it. But even in spite of that nitpick, I really like this thing. Next up is the Blue/Cube Wisp. When used, you slam into the ground, allowing you to destroy any destructible blocks nearby. You can also use it to change blue coin blocks into blue coins and vice versa, creating platforms for you to use. Like the previous two, this one cannot be used in 3D sections. This one doesn't inherently change up Sonic's movement like every other Wisp in the game does. I've read a lot of reviews of this game, and a lot of them say relatively the same thing about this Wisp, that being it's probably the weakest/worst in the game. I don't agree with this consensus because this Wisp is actually my favorite in the game. It doesn't change up the controls, true, but I like that about it. I find the game already has great controls, so not changing things up actually works to its benefit. The Wisp lasts a decent amount of time, meaning the puzzles you do with this thing are pretty lengthy, but not too long to the point where it feels like failing sets you back a huge amount. And while I didn't acknowledge this with the other Wisp because they go by fairly fast, this one has arguably the best Wisp music of any Wisp in the game. So yeah, not changing things up too drastically, allowing for some fun puzzles and varied gameplay. Sign me up. The following Wisp in Starlight Carnival is the green/hover Wisp. When used, you can hold down the jump button to hover slowly into the air. You can also hit the boost button to travel along a trail of rings. This one can be used in both 2D and 3D. There isn't really much to say about this one because I feel the most neutral towards this one out of any Wisp in the game. It feels satisfying to pull off a big ring trail, but when you aren't doing that, you move very slowly. There are some pretty fun moments with it, like climbing up a giant aircraft carrier, but there are also some pretty boring moments with it too. So there's a pretty good mix of both good and bad stuff, but if I had to say whether or not I like it, I'd say I lean more towards liking it, because the music is pretty floaty and nice overall. Trust me, I'm gonna make up for this kind of boring entry right now. Next up on Planet Wisp, you get access to the Pink/Spike Wisp. This one allows you to stick to walls and roofs. You can also jump in this form, and you can spin dash by holding the boost button. Like most of these, it's only usable in 2D sections, and to be honest, I don't like Spike, like pretty much at all. My biggest problem is a big one. It controls very poorly to me. When moving along on the ground and up walls, if you're holding sideways, you have to come to a complete stop before you can change directions, and if not, you keep moving in the same direction, just now you're holding the other way. It's infuriating to switch directions, and in addition to this, it's slow. Sure, you can spin dash, but once you've started a spin dash, you have to wait for it to come to a complete stop before you can switch directions or jump, meaning it sucks for precise platforming. 2, it uses up so much of the Wisp meter that it's more viable to move around slowly, making imprecise moves and jumps than take what should be the more fun option of boosting around. Also, for what it's worth, the music for this thing sucks. So overall, this Wisp is pretty bad. It controls poorly, it's unsatisfying to try and use the fun option, it sounds annoying, and yeah, not good. However, somehow, it gets worse. Lastly, in Asteroid Coaster, you gain access to the final Wisp in the game, the Purple/Frenzy Wisp. When activated, you turn into a beast that runs around eating through any destructible surface in its way. The more you eat, the bigger you get. It's usable in both 2D and 3D environments. Yeah, this in my mind is the worst Wisp in the game, and no lie, one of the worst power-ups in any game I've ever played. Yeah, it's bad. Remember when I said Spike controls poorly? Yeah, that's really when you're trying to turn more so than anything, which is bad, but it's not as bad as this. This thing controls like crap, no matter what you're trying to do, whether it be jumping, turning, hell, even moving forward, it slips like crazy. Turning is by far the worst offender of this. Choosing to turn either left or right is a commitment because you veer too far in either direction, which makes turning back damn near impossible. So you're going to be hugging either end of the stage as you try to move forward. That is the biggest problem, admittedly. Secondly, it lasts way too short for it to actually be even viable. It's okay in 2D sections, but it's so short that even if there's something fun you can actually do with it, it doesn't last long enough for it to actually feel rewarding. Lastly, and I don't know how this is possible, the music is utterly terrible. It genuinely sounds like a generator being killed with a flamethrower. Like, it makes sense in context of the game, but that doesn't mean it's good or fun. So, this is the worst Wisp in the game. Take everything I said about Spike and amplify it, basically. I hate to end on such a dour note, but unfortunately that's the end of this second episode of the Sonic Colors review. Don't worry, next time we'll be talking about the soundtrack, and trust me, it is a huge step up from what we've talked about today. But have a good day everyone, and I'll see you in a bit.